Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. There is a light that settles over East London in the early hours of a July morning. Not quite darkness, not quite dawn. It is a gray, liminal hour when the city holds its breath and the streets are almost entirely still. On the morning of July 22nd, 2024, on Lynmouth Road in Walthamstow, neighbors were woken not by birdsong or the distant rumble of a passing night bus, but by a sound far more desperate. The voice of a young woman, bleeding and terrified, calling out a single name. That woman was Alana Odysseos. She was 32 years old, a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a woman who, by every account of those who loved her, filled every room she entered with music and laughter. She loved to dance. She adored her little girl. She hoped, despite everything life had already taken from her, that she might one day find someone worthy of that love she so freely gave. That hope would cost her everything. Alana was originally from Suffolk, a county of quiet villages and long coastal roads far removed from the noise of the capital. At some point, life drew her to East London, to Walthamstow, a vibrant, patchwork neighborhood where streets of Victorian terraces give way to bustling markets and corner cafes. She settled into a flat on Lynmouth Road with her young daughter, Victoria, who was just over 2 years old in the summer of 2024. Life had not been gentle with Alana. Those who knew her understood the weight she had carried quietly for years. She had suffered huge personal loss, having lost 2 partners, the fathers of her children, in circumstances that left her grief-stricken and vulnerable. Victoria's father, a man named Russ Lynn, had taken his own life, leaving Alana to raise their daughter alone. Yet for all this sorrow, those who loved Alana said she never allowed it to hollow her out. Her sister Tara described her as kind, caring, funny, and deeply protective. Another sister, Jasmine, spoke of a woman who was bright, loud, and loving. Someone whose presence made people feel alive. It was that openness, that capacity for love even in the shadow of grief, that made Alana vulnerable to what was coming. Shane March entered Alana's life sometime in the spring of 2024. He was 46 years old, originally from Lewisham in southeast London, a man who, had Alana known the full truth about him, she might never have allowed through her door. But she did not know the full truth, not at first. And by the time the truth revealed itself, he had already built walls around her. March's history was one of extraordinary violence. In January of the year 2000, when he was just 21 years old, he had taken a knife and stabbed a 17-year-old boy named Andre Drummond in the neck outside a McDonald's restaurant on Denmark Hill in South London. Andre had died from his injuries. March had gone there deliberately, arming himself beforehand, to confront a group of young men he believed had robbed his friends. The jury at his murder trial rejected his claim of self-defense and found him guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 13 years. He was released on life license in January 2013. The license meant he was technically still serving his sentence, free in the community, but subject to recall at any moment if he violated its terms. Within months, he had done exactly that. In July 2013, he assaulted a then-pregnant partner, stamping on her stomach in an act of calculated cruelty that resulted in his immediate recall to prison. He remained behind bars until February 2018, when he was released once more. For nearly 6.5 years after that, he kept himself below the radar of the probation service. No further recorded offenses, no recall. To any official observer, he appeared, at last, to be managing. Then he met Alana. Their relationship lasted approximately 4 months. From the outside, almost nothing of it was visible. That was by design. Within weeks, March had begun to construct an invisible cage around Alana's life. He monitored her constantly, demanding she answer her phone at any hour of the day or night, regardless of where she was or what she was doing. He made her video call him to prove she was alone at home. He told her she was not allowed to speak to other people, men especially, and insisted she delete the numbers of any male contacts from her phone. He destroyed her child's toys in fits of spite. He smashed a glass in her face. He sent her WhatsApp voice notes in which he screamed at her, called her names, and accused her of being unfaithful. The coercive control was not just physical. It was the slow, deliberate erosion of everything that held Alana's world together. He drove wedges between her and the people she loved, her parents, her sisters, her friends, isolating her methodically, the way a predator separates its prey from the herd. Those who noticed the change in her, the way she had grown quieter, more distant, more guarded, tried to reach her. When her loved ones urged her to leave him, she gave the answer that so many women in her position give. The answer that is not weakness, but rather the terrible logic of a heart that has been manipulated. She said she loved him, and that he had promised to change. She was afraid of him. She said so plainly to those she trusted. But she was also heartbreakingly still hoping. Sunday, July 21st, 2024, began as an ordinary summer day. By evening, however, something had shifted in the atmosphere of Alana's flat. She messaged her sister Jasmine, telling her that March was acting up. It was the kind of message that, in retrospect, carries an unbearable weight. A quiet alarm sent into the world by someone who perhaps sensed the danger gathering around her, but could not yet name it fully. Jasmine replied with love. "Oh sis, you deserve so much better." Alana's response, her last recorded words to her sister, was a sentence of devastating clarity. "Can't help who you love, but he don't love any of us." She knew. Somewhere in the deepest part of herself, she already knew. As midnight approached, neighbors heard the row intensifying. The argument had apparently begun over something trivial, a pair of trainers belonging to March. But in the hands of a man like Shane March, the trigger for violence is never the real reason for it. March was video recording the argument on his phone. Alana could be heard outside, in her dressing gown, locked out of her own flat by the man inside it. She had forgotten her keys. March refused to let her back in, even as her 2-year-old daughter slept alone inside. Alana stood on the street below, crying, apologizing for something that was not her fault. CCTV footage captured her a little before midnight, walking alone along Station Road toward Lynmouth Road, barefoot in her dressing gown. A young mother turned out of her own home in the middle of the night by the man she loved. Somehow, a couple of hours later, she was back inside the flat. What happened in those early hours inside the flat on Lynmouth Road was reconstructed from evidence, from forensics, and from March's own words, including, grotesquely, a confession he later gave to a prison officer while waiting for a bail hearing, apparently unable to stop himself from speaking about it. March had armed himself with a kitchen knife from the flat, a blade 24 centimeters long and almost 3 centimeters wide. The argument continued. At some point, standing in the kitchen with Alana, something inside Shane March gave way. He picked up the knife. He stabbed her. He did not stop. She had been stabbed in the chest, the stomach, the pelvis, both shoulders, the buttocks, her right arm, her thighs, and her lower legs. The wounds to her legs were consistent with her being on the floor and kicking out, fighting desperately to survive. Several of the injuries were defensive wounds on her arms, evidence of a woman trying to protect herself with her bare hands against a kitchen knife wielded again and again and again. Of the 19 stab wounds, 5 were individually fatal. A 6th would likely have been fatal on its own. 3 of the stab wounds were delivered with such force that the blade penetrated through bone. 1 passed entirely through Alana's shoulder blade. She had been approximately 7 to 8 weeks pregnant. Somehow, still alive, she made it outside. At just before 3 o'clock in the morning, neighbors on Lynmouth Road were woken by the sound of a woman's voice. When they looked outside, they found Alana standing in the street, bleeding from multiple wounds, clutching her side. She was still wearing her nightdress and dressing gown. Despite everything, the pain, the blood, the knowledge of what had been done to her, she found the strength to point at the man walking away from her and shout the words that would echo through a courtroom in London more than a year later. Shane stabbed me. He stabbed me. Help. Help. Two neighbors called 999 within seconds of each other at 2:58 in the morning. The police and the London ambulance service arrived within minutes. Alana's neighbors had already knelt beside her in the street, trying to help, pressing their hands to her wounds in the dark while the sirens drew closer. But 5 separately fatal stab wounds were already at work inside her. At 3:52 in the morning, less than an hour after her neighbors found her, Alana Odysseos was pronounced dead. Inside the flat, her daughter Victoria lay unharmed, asleep, now an orphan. She was not yet 3 years old. Shane March had not fled in panic. He walked away from Alana's body with the methodical composure of a man who had already begun calculating. As he moved through the quiet streets of Walthamstow in the hours before dawn, he disposed of evidence piece by piece. He dropped the bloodied kitchen knife near a neighbor's front door. He discarded items of clothing, a small rucksack, other items taken from the flat. He then took 3 mobile phones, including both his own and Alana's, and dropped them down a drain in a road near Lynmouth Road. But before he dropped his phone, he recorded 2 voice notes. One was addressed to his probation officer. The other, more haunting still, was intended for his mother. In the second, he said, "Mum, I just killed a woman, and I'm going back to jail." He did not send either message. Perhaps even he understood, in that fractured interval between the act and its consequences, that some words cannot be taken back. Both phone and voice notes were recovered by police when one of the 3 phones was later retrieved from the drain. At approximately 4:20 in the morning, March walked into Cream's Cafe on Church Hill, a late-night dessert parlor still open at that hour. He was covered in blood. The man working alone behind the counter listened, stunned, as March told him he had stabbed or killed his wife, who was baby. The cafe worker called the police. At around 4:41 in the morning, officers arrived and arrested Shane March. He did not attempt to run. He made no effort to deny what he had done. Instead, standing outside the cafe in the half-light of a summer morning, he announced himself and his crime to the officers arresting him. "I did it. I killed her. Alana Odysseos. I stabbed her to death." In the police van on the way to Barking Police Station, still speaking, he said, "I hope she isn't dead. I hope the baby in her belly is still alive. But you know what? I did say to her, have the abortion." Later, in a prison waiting room, he told a prison officer in explicit detail how it had happened. About seeing red in the kitchen, about grabbing the knife, about Alana's last words to him as she was being stabbed. "Please stop. Please stop. You have murdered me." When formally interviewed by police with a solicitor present, he answered every question with 2 words, no comment. The case came to trial at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, in October 2025, more than a year after Alana's death. By this point, the public had not yet been told about March's prior conviction for murder. A reporting restriction had been in place throughout, to ensure a fair trial. Only when March finally entered his guilty plea in the courtroom was it lifted, and the full extent of his history could at last be told. March initially contested the murder charge. He admitted to the killing. He could hardly do otherwise given the evidence, but claimed diminished responsibility, arguing that he had been suffering from an abnormality of mind at the time. His legal team engaged a neuropsychologist, Dr. Marzio Acioni, to provide expert evidence in support of this partial defense. The prosecution, led by Louise Oakley, presented a thorough counter case. CCTV footage, witness statements, the recorded voice notes, the confession to the prison officer, and the sheer calculated nature of his actions after the killing, disposing of 3 phones, discarding the knife, the clothing, the rucksack, none of which suggested a man incapable of deliberate thought. On the 7th day of trial, having heard the prosecution close its case, Dr. Acioni reviewed the totality of the evidence and revised his opinion. He concluded that at the time of the murder, March had not been suffering from any abnormality of mental functioning sufficient to meet the legal threshold for diminished responsibility. Without his expert, March's defense collapsed. He was rearraigned in open court before the jury and pleaded guilty to murder. The jury returned a verdict of guilty. It was October 17, 2025. Shane March refused to attend his own sentencing on October 31, 2025. He told prison staff it was only sentencing. He was absent from the courtroom at the Old Bailey where, one by one, Alana's family, her father Alan, her mother Karen, and her three sisters Lorraine, Tara, and Jasmine, read their victim impact statements aloud. Jasmine spoke of her sister as a bright, loud, loving woman who filled a room with music and laughter. She spoke of a woman who loved to dance, who adored Victoria, and who had always deserved to be safe. The judge, presiding over the sentencing, described the statements as powerfully moving and heartbreaking. He acknowledged plainly that no sentence he could impose would ever reflect the true value of Alana's life or repair what had been shattered. The judge reviewed March's history in full. The 2000 murder of 17-year-old Andre Drummond, stabbed in the neck outside a McDonald's. The 2013 assault on a pregnant partner, stamped on the stomach. The second release in 2018. The years of apparent compliance, right up until the moment they ended. He considered whether to impose a whole life order, a sentence with no possibility of release. Given March's previous murder conviction, the law made this the starting point. In the end, the judge concluded it was not the rarest and clearest case requiring that ultimate sentence, citing March's traumatic brain injury at 17, the apparently spontaneous nature of both murders, and the gap of 24 years between them. But he did not minimize what had been done. The aggravating factors were devastating. The prolonged and excessive violence, the 19 stab wounds inflicted on a pregnant woman, the coercive and controlling behavior preceding the murder, the presence of a sleeping toddler in the flat, the deliberate disposal of evidence afterwards. Shane March was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 42 years. Given his age, 47 at sentencing, the mathematics were stark. He may never leave prison. The judge said as much. It may be, he noted with measured precision, that March would never be released. But the chance exists. Victoria, Alana's daughter, was found unharmed inside the flat in the early hours of July 22, 2024. She was just over 2 years old. She will grow up never knowing her mother's voice except through recordings, never feeling the arms of the woman who loved to dance and loved music and loved her little daughter. She will grow up knowing eventually, as all children in such circumstances do, the terrible shape of what was taken from her. Alana's family has been left to carry a grief that, as the judge acknowledged, cannot be fathomed by those who have not experienced the horror of such a tragedy. A father and a mother who buried their child. 3 sisters who lost the one who filled rooms with laughter. Friends who had seen the warning signs, who had urged Alana to leave, who will carry the particular anguish of those who tried and could not save someone they loved. The Crown Prosecution Service, in its statement following the sentencing, put it plainly. Shane March showed no remorse when arrested, and his previous offending revealed a worrying pattern of emotional and physical abuse. The system that had released him twice had been unable to prevent what he did to Alana. Alana Odysseos had wanted to be loved. That is what the court heard. It is what the prosecutor said on her behalf, and it is perhaps the most important thing to understand about who she was. She was not naive. She had survived real losses, real grief, and she had kept going. She was a woman of resilience and warmth and ferocious love for her children. She had simply placed her trust in someone who was not worthy of it, and who was dangerous in ways she could not have fully known. She said it herself in the last message she ever sent her sister. Can't help who you love. She was right, and she deserved so much better. Story 2. The winter sky over Warrington was pale and cold on the morning of February 11th, 2023, the kind of gray English February that settles over the northwest of England like a wool blanket, muffling color, deadening sound, making the world feel smaller than it actually is. In the town of Birchwood, a 16-year-old girl with dark hair, a love of makeup, and thousands of followers on TikTok pulled on her coat, stepped out her front door, and waved goodbye to a camera she did not know was watching. Her name was Brianna Gay, and she was going to meet a friend. She would never come home. Brianna Gay was, by every account of those who loved her, the kind of person who fills a room without trying. Her family described her as a larger-than-life character who would leave a lasting impression on all that met her. Beautiful, witty, hilarious, strong, fearless, and one of a kind. She was a transgender girl who had come into her own identity with a boldness that many people twice her age could not muster, expressing herself through fashion, humor, and a vibrant social media presence that had earned her thousands of followers on TikTok and Instagram. She was 16 years old. She laughed loudly. She spoke her mind. Behind that brightness, there were struggles that her mother, Esther Gay, knew about and worried over in the quiet hours of the night. Around the age of 14, Brianna had begun sinking into darkness, a creeping isolation that pulled her away from routines and relationships. There were weeks when she would not wash, would not engage with the world around her, would retreat into herself in ways that frightened those who cared for her most. She was eventually referred for treatment and diagnosed with both ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. She had battled depression and anxiety. Esther had reached out to the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, known in England as CMHS, but Brianna resisted engagement, the way teenagers sometimes do, convinced in their suffering that no help could reach them. Still, Brianna endured. Still, she dressed up, made content, and showed the world only her laughter. What Esther could not have known, what no parent could have conceived, was that someone at Brianna's school had already decided her daughter would die. Scarlett Jenkinson was 15 years old, intelligent, and deeply, disturbingly hidden. On the surface, she was a schoolgirl, a classmate of Brianna's, someone who texted her, arranged to meet her, called herself a friend. Beneath that surface was something else entirely, a mind that had been marinating, since the age of 14, in violence. Jenkinson had downloaded a Tor browser, a specialized piece of software that allows users to access parts of the internet unreachable by ordinary means, and used it to watch what are known as Red Room videos, recordings of real-life torture and murder circulated on the dark web. She had compiled detailed notes on serial killers, studying their methods the way other teenagers study for exams. She described herself as a Satanist. Around age 14, she had begun to fantasize about killing people, and that she enjoyed dark fantasies about violence and torture. She had, before Brianna, written a kill list. The list contained 5 names, children she disliked, children she had grievances against, however trivial those grievances may have been. But as weeks passed and the list evolved, one name rose to the top not because of hatred or envy or any particular personal conflict. Brianna Gay's name was at the top because, as the 2 killers thought she would be an easy target, Jenkinson had told her co-conspirator that Brianna's depression, her anxiety, her emotional vulnerability, her struggles made her accessible, made her killable. The co-conspirator was Eddie Ratcliffe, also 15. Where Jenkinson was the architect, Ratcliffe was the willing instrument. His motivations were a tangled mess of admiration for Jenkinson, a desire to impress her, and a hostility toward Brianna rooted in her transgender identity. He had wanted Jenkinson's help with a girl he was interested in. Jenkinson offered something else in return for his assistance. Ratcliffe appeared to view the murder as a project, something to be organized and completed, something that did not trouble his sleep the way it should have. The plan began taking shape weeks before February. The pair communicated in messages that was a chilling, exchanges that revealed a shared, constructed world of dark obsession, a vocabulary of violence that they had developed between themselves in secret. They watched Sweeney Todd the night before the murder, the story of a barber who kills his customers, using it as a kind of preparation, a ritual for what was to come. But even before that night, there had already been one attempt on Brianna's life. Jenkinson had obtained a quantity of tablets, red ones, and told Brianna, in the casual way of a friend sharing a secret, that they would give her a pleasant high. Brianna trusted this. She took them. Within days, she was severely ill, vomiting, weak, unable to understand why her body was failing her. Esther took her daughter to the doctor, genuinely believing Brianna might be suffering from appendicitis. She noticed red specks in her daughter's vomit and could not identify them. They were the remnants of the tablets Jenkinson had fed her. The poisoning had not worked. Brianna survived, not knowing she had survived anything at all. She did not know that her friend had simply moved on to a more direct method. The morning of February 11th, 2023 began like any Saturday. Esther Gay had no particular reason for alarm. Brianna received a message from Jenkinson asking her to take a bus to Culcheth Library, a reasonable, ordinary-sounding errand for a teenage girl on a winter afternoon. Brianna told her mother she was going to meet up with Scarlett. There was nothing in the message, nothing in her daughter's manner, that would have made a mother say no, stay home, do not go. At 12:45 in the afternoon, a doorbell camera on a house near Brianna's home in Birchwood captured her stepping outside. Coat on, the world ahead of her completely unaware. She texted her mother. She walked 25 minutes to Birchwood railway station and boarded a bus at 1:38 p.m., texting Esther again from the bus, keeping her mother informed the way teenagers do when they want to demonstrate responsibility. The texts were ordinary. Nothing was wrong. Culcheth Linear Park sits on the edge of the village of Culcheth, about a 10-minute walk from the library where Brianna had been told to go. It is a long, narrow stretch of green, trees on either side of a path, a quiet place in winter, the kind of park that empties out when the cold settles in. Jenkinson and Ratcliffe were already there, waiting. What happened next in those minutes inside the park is known only in the terrible clinical language of forensic evidence. The post-mortem examination ordered by the Home Office found that Brianna had been stabbed 28 times. The wounds were to her head, her neck, her chest, and her back. The force behind each wound was described by the court as considerable. The judge, Mrs. Justice Amanda Yip, would later say that the injuries together point to a very sustained and violent assault, and that, sadly, Brianna can't have lost consciousness immediately. She was aware she was being attacked. She would have felt it. Prosecutors described the attack as extremely brutal and punishing. No words were strong enough. Brianna's body was found on a path in the park. Emergency services were called. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Esther Gay was at home when the world changed. She was waiting for her daughter to come back. The texts had stopped. The hours had stretched. And then came the news that no parent's mind is built to receive. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives from Cheshire Police worked through the night and into the next day, tracing Brianna's last movements through CCTV footage, phone records, and witness accounts. Within 24 hours of the murder, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, both 15 years old, had been arrested. When detectives searched their phones, they found a world hidden behind teenage faces. Messages planning the attack, a handwritten plan, evidence of a shared obsession with death, violence, and cruelty. They found the kill list. They found the notes on serial killers. They found the communications that laid bare, in the two teenagers' own words, every step of what they had done and why. Both initially denied carrying out the attack. Each blamed the other. The knife, a hunting knife, purchased deliberately, brought to the park in preparation, had driven 28 wounds into a 16-year-old girl who had come to meet a friend. The trial opened at Manchester Crown Court and lasted 3 weeks, drawing intense public attention across the United Kingdom. Because both defendants were juveniles at the time of the offense, their identities had initially been protected by anonymity orders, a routine legal protection afforded to children in criminal proceedings. The court heard evidence that laid out the full landscape of planning. The dark web browsing, the kill list, the poisoning attempt, the Sweeney Todd viewing the night before, the meticulous sequence of messages luring Brianna to the park. Prosecutor Deanna Here KC argued that the digital evidence showed they were preoccupied with torture, murder, and death. On December 20th, 2023, After 4 hours and 40 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Both Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe were found guilty of the murder of Brianna Gay. The following day, Mrs. Justice Yip ruled that the anonymity orders protecting the two convicted murderers would be lifted. The judge determined that there was a strong public interest in the full and unrestricted reporting of what is plainly an exceptional case. For the first time, the country put faces and names to the teenagers who had planned the killing of a 16-year-old girl in a park on a Saturday afternoon. Sentencing came on February 2nd, 2024 at Manchester Crown Court. The courtroom heard victim impact statements from Brianna's parents and stepfather, words that attempted the impossible task of measuring the weight of a lost child's life in the language available to the living. Esther Gay, who had watched her daughter navigate the world with courage and color, now had to find words for a silence that would last the rest of her own life. Mrs. Justice Yip addressed the two teenagers directly. She spoke of Jenkinson as a person driven by a deep desire to kill, a desire that, chillingly, had not abated even in detention, where Jenkinson had reportedly written a new kill list that included the names of some of her carers. The judge warned that both defendants may never be released if they continued to pose a danger to others. To Ratcliffe, she said, "Although your motives may not have aligned with hers, you were aware of what Scarlett intended and why. You participated in this brutal murder, fully aware of the sadistic motives behind it, and cannot escape the same consequences." The judge found that the murder was both sadistic in nature and partly motivated by hostility towards Brianna because of her transgender identity. The Crown Prosecution Service called the case one of the most disturbing it had ever encountered. Scarlett Jenkinson was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 22 years before she would be eligible to be considered for parole. Eddie Ratcliffe received a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years. The parole board, Mrs. Justice Yip said, would determine if and when either of them could be released, and only then if they no longer posed a danger. If they were ever released, they would remain on license for life and could be recalled to prison at any time. In December 2024, Ratcliffe's attempt to appeal his sentence was rejected by the courts. In the months that followed, Esther Gay became a voice her daughter could no longer be. She began campaigning publicly for stronger protections around children's access to harmful content online. Speaking of the dark web material, the torture videos, the algorithm-fed obsessions that had shaped the mind of her daughter's killer, she spoke with a grief that had not made her quieter, but louder. She pushed for legislation. She sat across tables from technology executives and politicians and told them what a hunting knife and a park path and 28 stab wounds looked like in the language of a mother who waited at home for a text that never came. An inquest into Brianna's death began in October 2024, seeking answers to questions that parents and safeguarding professionals needed to understand. How Jenkinson had been allowed to transfer to Brianna's school, how warning signs had been missed, how systems designed to protect children had failed. Those questions did not diminish Brianna's life. They existed precisely because her life had mattered. Vigils had been held across the United Kingdom in the days after her death. In Glasgow, in Dublin, in towns and cities where transgender people and their allies gathered in the cold with candles to grieve a girl they had never met but recognized. Brianna Gay had been one of them, someone who had fought to be herself in a world that did not always make that easy, who had done so with humor and beauty and an uncompromising presence that earned her thousands of strangers who cared about her. She had been strong, her family said, fearless, one of a kind. She had stepped out her front door on a gray February morning, texted her mother from the bus, and walked toward the only future she knew. She was 16 years old, and she had every reason to believe that the rest of her life was still ahead of her. It should have been. Story 3. There is a kind of deception so methodical, so painstakingly constructed over so many months, that when it finally collapses it takes something irreplaceable with it. In the autumn of 2020, in a small Texas town most of America had never heard of, a lie that had been built brick by brick for nearly a year crumbled. and in its wreckage lay the body of a 21-year-old woman and the life of her unborn daughter. What happened in New Boston, Texas, on the morning of October 9th, 2020, was not a crime of sudden rage or reckless impulse. It was the terminus of a long, deliberate road, and understanding how Taylor Parker arrived at the end of that road requires going back to the beginning of the lie itself. New Boston is a quiet place. It sits in Bowie County in the far northeast corner of Texas, pressed close against the Arkansas state line, roughly 160 miles from the bright lights of Dallas. The town has a population of barely 4,600 people. Everyone, as the saying goes, knows everyone. The roads are flat, the summers are hot, and life moves at the pace of a place where community still means something. It was the kind of place where a young woman could take engagement photographs for her neighbors and be welcomed as a friend, where small kindnesses circulated like currency, where trust was extended freely because the alternative was too lonely to consider. Reagan Michelle Simmons grew up in this world. She was 21 years old in the fall of 2020, young, warm, the kind of person who lit up a room not because she tried to, but because that was simply who she was. She had married Homer Hancock, and together they had built the small, earnest life that young couples build in towns like New Boston. They had a 3-year-old daughter, and in October 2020, Reagan was 35 weeks pregnant, 8 months deep into a pregnancy that had filled the house with the particular joy that only an expected baby can bring. The nursery was being prepared. The name had been chosen. Her daughter, when she came, would be called Braxlyn Sage Hancock. Among the people Reagan knew in her daily life was a woman named Taylor Renee Parker. Parker had photographed Reagan and Homer's engagement and their wedding. She had been there, camera in hand, for those milestone moments, those hours of joy and promise. They were not close friends, but as somewhat friends, the kind of acquaintance built on shared proximity and mutual pleasantness. Parker was familiar. She was trusted in the casual, unremarkable way that neighbors and acquaintances come to be trusted in small towns. Nobody knew what was happening inside Taylor Parker's head. Taylor Parker was 27 years old in the autumn of 2020. She had a boyfriend, a man whose affection she desperately wanted to keep, whose regard she seemed to treat not as a given, but as something that required constant maintenance, constant proof. At some point, Parker came to believe, or perhaps simply decided, that a pregnancy would secure her position in his life, that a baby would make her indispensable, that a child would give their relationship a gravity and permanence it might otherwise lack. The problem was that Taylor Parker was not pregnant. What followed was one of the most elaborate and sustained deceptions that Parker began by telling her boyfriend she was pregnant. She then had to keep that story alive, day after day, week after week, month after month. She purchased a prosthetic baby bump, a convincingly realistic silicone belly that she wore to simulate the physical changes of pregnancy. She acquired fake ultrasound images and shared them as though they were genuine. She tracked the trimesters, calibrated her behavior, and performed the rituals of expectant motherhood with the discipline of someone rehearsing a very long play. When the time came, she held a gender reveal party, surrounded by people celebrating a pregnancy that did not exist, a baby that had never been conceived. At each stage, the lie demanded more. More evidence, more physical proof, more documentation of a reality that was entirely manufactured. Then Parker had conducted intensive, methodical research, online searches for how to fake a pregnancy convincingly, how to produce convincing documentation, how to manage the expectations of people around her. The research was not casual. It was the research of someone building a long-term architecture of untruth, someone who understood that the longer the lie lasted, the more catastrophic its eventual collapse would become. And still the months passed. The fake belly grew. The fake due date approached. And Taylor Parker had no baby to show anyone. She needed a real one. The morning of October 9th, 2020 began like any other in New Boston. The October air carried the first real hints of autumn, a lightening of the brutal Texas heat. Reagan Simmons Hancock was at home with her 3-year-old daughter. At 35 weeks, She was close enough to her due date to feel the particular imminence of those final weeks. The heaviness, the anticipation, the waiting that every expectant mother knows. Parker arrived at Reagan's home that morning. There are no witnesses who can say exactly what words were exchanged at the door, what reason was given, what small social nicety smoothed the threshold crossing. Reagan likely had no reason to be alarmed. This was someone she knew, someone who had photographed her wedding, someone familiar. Parker attacked Reagan Simmons Hancock with devastating, sustained violence. She beat her. She slashed her. Reagan had been cut hundreds of times. She inflicted injuries so numerous and severe that the medical examiners had no ambiguity about the nature of the assault. And then, while Reagan was still alive, still fighting, Parker performed what would describe as a crude surgical procedure. Working without medical training and without proper instruments, she cut Reagan's abdomen from hip to hip and removed the baby from her womb. Reagan's 3-year-old daughter was in the house while this happened. Parker left the home. She drove. She headed north out of Texas, toward Oklahoma, with the infant in her car, the baby who had been born in an act of violence, who had come into the world in the worst possible way, who was already desperately fragile. That morning, a Texas state trooper observed a vehicle moving erratically on the highway, speeding and swerving. He activated his lights and brought it to a stop. When he approached the car and looked through the window, he saw Taylor Parker in the driver's seat. She was covered in dried blood. In her lap, she held a newborn infant. The umbilical cord was still attached, and it appeared, at first glance, to be emerging from Parker's own clothing, as though she had just given birth on the roadside. The trooper, processing what he was seeing, called for medical help. Parker and the baby were transported to a hospital in Idabel, Oklahoma. At the hospital, medical staff examined Taylor Parker. They found no physiological evidence whatsoever that she had recently given birth. No signs of labor, no signs of delivery, no physical indicators of a woman who had just brought a child into the world. The medical team told investigators what the evidence plainly showed. This woman had not given birth. Confronted with this finding, the story Parker had rehearsed for months finally buckled. She admitted that she had been in what she called a physical altercation with Reagan Simmons Hancock. She admitted she had taken the baby from Reagan's body. She was immediately arrested. At Reagan's home, investigators arrived to find a scene of incomprehensible horror. Reagan Simmons Hancock, 21 years old, 8 months pregnant, mother of a 3-year-old, lay on the floor of her home. She was dead. The little girl who had been there during those final terrible hours was found alive. Baby Braxton Sage Hancock, the child who had been at the center of this entire tragic architecture of deception, was pronounced dead at the hospital in Idabel. She had never had a chance. She had been torn from her mother before the world was ready for her, and the world had not been kind to her in the brief hours she spent in it. The investigation that followed was the work of many hands. Rankin County investigators, Texas State Police, and forensic specialists worked methodically through the digital trail that Parker had left behind. Special Agent Dustin Estes spent long hours examining Parker's phone and her search history. What he found was a portrait of premeditation so thorough that it removed any possibility of accident or impulse from the equation. On the morning of October 9th, the same morning she drove to Reagan's home, Parker had been watching videos. Not videos about true crime, not casual browsing. She had specifically watched a video about the physical examination of an infant delivered prematurely at 35 weeks. She had been preparing in the most clinical and chilling way to handle a baby of exactly the gestational age that Reagan was carrying. The investigators also pieced together the full scope of the fake pregnancy, the prosthetic belly, the manufactured ultrasounds, the gender reveal party attended by people who genuinely believed they were celebrating a real child. The months of lies, sustained and performed with a consistency that spoke to enormous psychological investment. What drove a woman to construct and maintain such an elaborate fiction? The prosecution's answer was the one that fit the evidence most cleanly. Parker was terrified of losing her boyfriend, and she had decided that a baby was the solution to that fear. When the due date approached and the lie could no longer be sustained by props and photographs, she identified a solution in the most devastating place imaginable, in the womb of a young woman who had once trusted her enough to let her photograph her wedding. Reagan Simmons Hancock had been chosen not because of any conflict, not because of any personal grievance. She had been chosen because she was pregnant, because she was known to Parker, and because she was accessible. The trial of Taylor Renee Parker opened in Bowie County in the fall of 2022, 2 years after the crime. It lasted 3 weeks. The jury, 6 men and 6 women, sat through testimony that prosecutors described as the kind of evidence that demanded the most serious possible legal response. Kelly Crisp, the first assistant district attorney who led the prosecution, was methodical and relentless. She walked the jury through the timeline of the fake pregnancy, the digital research, the morning of October 9th. She showed them the crime scene photographs, images that the jury would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Homer Hancock, Reagan's husband, took the stand and spoke about his wife and the friend he had welcomed into their lives. He described Parker as someone he had trusted. His testimony was quiet and steady, and devastating in the way that grief stripped of theatrics always is. The defense attorney, Jeff Harrelson, asked the jury to see the layers behind the act. The mental illness, the desperation, the ways in which Parker had been failed by the people around her who watched the fake pregnancy unfold without intervening. There was no safety net when everyone saw the wheels were off, Harrelson told the jury. He reminded them that Parker was human, that the word monster was a device used to distance, to dehumanize, to close the door on complexity. It was a hard argument to make against the weight of the evidence in front of them. The jury deliberated for approximately 1 hour. They returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of capital murder. Then came the sentencing phase, the second, separate legal question of whether Taylor Parker should live or die for what she had done. The prosecution argued that the crime, premeditated in meticulous detail, carried out against a pregnant woman and her unborn child, justified the ultimate penalty. Harrelson again asked the jury to spare his client's life, to choose imprisonment over execution. Reagan's mother, Jessica Brooks, rose to address the court. She turned to face Taylor Parker directly. Her voice carried everything that grief and fury and love can produce in a mother who has watched her child buried. She said the words that the courtroom would not forget, that Reagan had been alive when Parker cut her open, still fighting, still breathing, still trying to protect her babies, even as the unthinkable was being done to her. The jury deliberated for just over an hour. They sentenced Taylor Renee Parker to death. Judge John Tidwell received the verdict, turned to the bailiff, and said the words that ended the courtroom chapter of this case. Take her to death row. On November 9th, 2022, Taylor Parker entered the Texas prison system at the age of 29. She was placed on death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She became one of the very few women in Texas history to receive the death penalty. Her attorneys appealed. In the following years, they raised 25 separate points of error, challenging the venue, the evidence, the conduct of the prosecution, the scope of expert testimony. In September 2025, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals heard oral arguments on the appeal. One of the arguments raised was that the prosecution had engaged in improper conduct during trial. On November 6, 2025, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a unanimous decision. All 25 points of error were rejected. The conviction was upheld. The death sentence was upheld. The court found that the evidence had been sufficient, the trial had been fair, and the jury's verdict had been just. First Assistant District Attorney Kelly Crisp, who had prosecuted the case, issued a statement the following day. The Court of Criminal Appeals' decision in Taylor Parker's case is confirmation of what every one of us in Bowie County already knew, she said, that the verdicts handed down by this jury were just and right. Reagan Simmons Hancock was 21 years old when she died. She had a husband who loved her, a 3-year-old daughter who called for her mother, and a daughter she had already named, a daughter who had been given a beautiful name and who never got to use it in the world. Braxton Sage Hancock lived only as long as she was carried from one terrible place to another, and then she was gone too. There is a photograph that exists somewhere, taken by the woman who would one day destroy her, of Reagan on her wedding day, wearing white, full of the ordinary, extraordinary hope of a young woman beginning her life. That photograph exists because Reagan trusted, because she opened her door, because in a small town in northeast Texas, she believed that the familiar face on her porch meant no harm. That trust was the last thing Taylor Parker took from her before she took everything else. In New Boston, where everyone knows everyone, the absence of Reagan Simmons Hancock is felt in the particular way that small communities feel the loss of their young, not as an abstraction, but as a gap in the daily fabric of life. A voice that no longer rings out, a laugh that no longer crosses a room, a mother who cannot watch her daughter grow. Some silences are louder than any sound a town can make. In Bowie County, Texas, that silence has a name. Story 4. There is a particular kind of morning in the English countryside that seems almost too beautiful for anything bad to ever happen in it. The sky turns a pale silver before the sun crests the hills, and the fields lie still and wet with dew, the air carrying the smell of cut grass and cool earth. On the morning of June 18, 2021, that kind of morning settled over the village of Duckmanton in Derbyshire, a small, quiet corner of the English Midlands where the roads are narrow and the hedgerows grow tall, and where a young woman named Gracie Spinks had spent much of her short life doing the thing she loved most, caring for her horse. She was 23 years old. Her parents, Allison Ward and Richard Spinks, had raised a daughter who was warm and outdoorsy, the kind of young woman who felt most herself when she was outdoors, around animals, moving through the natural world with ease and confidence. She was a swimming instructor by profession, patient, capable, good with people. She was also a devoted horse rider, and the paddock at Blue Lodge Farm in Duckmanton was one of her most reliable sanctuaries, the place where the rest of life's noise fell away. On the morning of June 18th, she drove there as she often did, to look after her horse. She had no reason to believe it would be anything other than an ordinary morning. But something had been set in motion long before that morning. A chain of events had been building for more than a year, with warnings that went unheeded, with danger that was downgraded and dismissed. And it was on that quiet, silver-skied morning that it finally, catastrophically arrived. In the spring of 2020, when the world had locked itself indoors and many people found themselves in unfamiliar circumstances. Like thousands of others across Britain, Gracie had been furloughed from her work as a swimming instructor during the pandemic, and to keep busy and earn income, she took a temporary position at a place called Zbite, an e-commerce company based in Chesterfield, Derbyshire, that packed and dispatched goods from a warehouse. It was there that she met Michael Sellers. Sellers was 35 years old, more than a decade older than Gracie, and had been working at Zbite since 2015. He held a supervisor's role, someone who managed the warehouse floor, who had authority over the people who worked beneath him, who knew the rhythms and routines of the place intimately. When Gracie started, he was her supervisor. In the early weeks, the two of them developed a brief friendship which was not romantic. Gracie was social and easy to talk to. She did not have any romantic interest in Sellers. Their connection was the casual, surface-level warmth that can develop between colleagues in a shared workplace. The kind of friendship that exists within the boundaries of a specific place and time, and carries no particular weight beyond it. For Gracie, it was unremarkable. She could not have known that for Michael Sellers, it was anything but. What she did not know, what no one at Zbite apparently told her when she joined, was that Sellers had a history. He had, the inquest would later hear, previously given unwanted attention to 7 other female colleagues at the same company. 7 women, in the same workplace, who had experienced the same pattern of behavior from the same man. Gracie Spinks was not informed of this before she began working alongside him. On December 16, 2020, Gracie ended the friendship. There was no dramatic confrontation, no argument or falling out, did as gently ending that friendship, the kind of graceful, clear, but kind withdrawal that most people would recognize as simply closing a door. She had her reasons. Perhaps she had sensed something off in Sellers' behavior, or perhaps she simply did not want to pursue the connection any further. Whatever her reasoning, she communicated it as cleanly as she could, and she moved on. Michael Sellers did not accept it. What followed was not the disappointment of a man who had hoped for more and accepted the reality when it was offered to him. What followed was something far more troubling. Sellers continued to contact Gracie after she had asked him to stop. He began using his position as a supervisor, the authority he held by virtue of his role, to recruit other colleagues to spy on her, to report back on her movements and activities within the workplace. He watched her on the warehouse's CCTV cameras, monitoring where she was, what she was doing, how she moved through the spaces they shared. The power he exercised over her was not physical, not yet, but it was real, and it was suffocating. When Gracie reported his behavior to their employer, Sellers was suspended from work. He responded to his suspension by appealing it, arguing that Gracie was lying, that the woman he had spent months watching and following and refusing to leave alone was simply making things up. The appeal, and its implications for how Gracie was perceived, would cast a long and damaging shadow over everything that came next. In February 2021, Gracie went to Derbyshire Police. She was not making a casual inquiry. She was frightened. She told officers that Sellers had become obsessed with her, that he would not leave her alone, and that he had shown up, had been waiting for her, near the very field where she kept her horse. The field in Duckmanton. The place she had always felt safe. For a young woman to walk into a police station and report that a man has followed her to her private sanctuary, the one place outside of her home where she spent her most vulnerable, unguarded hours, that is an act of courage. It is also an act of trust. Trust that the people she is speaking to understand what she is telling them. Trust that they recognize the seriousness of what she is describing. Trust that they will protect her. The police initially marked the report correctly. It was assessed as a real and immediate risk, the kind of categorization that acknowledges genuine danger and calls for a genuine response. For a moment, it seemed as though the system was going to work. But the investigation that followed was poorly carried out. Officers spoke to Gracie and to Sellers separately. They issued him with a verbal warning, and then they closed the stalking case down, reclassifying it as low risk. No stalking prevention order was sought. No further investigation was conducted. No one, the inquest would later find, properly connected the dots between the man who had previously made 7 other women uncomfortable at the same company and the man who was now, by his former colleague's own account, waiting for her in a field. The verbal warning given to Sellers was not enough to guarantee Gracie's safety, and may, in fact, have caused his behavior to escalate, as if being told by police to stop had not deterred him but inflamed him. Gracie went home, and Sellers went free. 6 weeks before Gracie Spinks was murdered, 2 people walking their dog near her stables found something that should have stopped everything in its tracks. It was a bag. Inside it were a hammer, an axe, knives, and a handwritten note. The note contained 3 words, "Don't lie." The dog walkers handed it to police. The bag was near the very stables where Gracie kept her horse. There was an active stalking case, however inadequately managed, involving a man who had been told that Gracie was lying. The note said exactly that, in his language, in his terms, "Don't lie." And the bag was filled with weapons. What police did with this discovery was one of the most painful moments of evidence presented at the inquest. Officers did not treat the bag as evidence. They did not connect it to Gracie's case. They did not investigate who had left it or why. They categorized it as found property, as if it were a lost wallet or a misplaced bicycle, something mundane and administrative, something that required a form and a shelf and no further thought. One officer, the inquest heard, suggested the bag of weapons more likely resembled a kid's game. A sergeant and 2 constables were later served with misconduct orders specifically for their handling of this discovery, for what the inquest jury identified as an egregious failure to recognize an explicit warning sign that was sitting directly in front of them. Later investigation would confirm that the bag of weapons belonged to Michael Sellers. He had placed it there. He had written that note. The man who was telling everyone that Gracie was lying had gone, in private, to the place she visited alone and left a cache of weapons and a message addressed at her version of events. It was not a kid's game. It was a dress rehearsal. In the days before June 18, 2021, CCTV cameras that Sellers did not know were watching him captured what investigators would later describe as the behavior of a man engaged in significant planning and preparation. He was filmed loading his car. He was tracked driving toward Duckmanton. He had prepared carefully and deliberately, the coroner would later conclude, removing himself, as he saw it, from any form of accountability. Gracie arrived at Blue Lodge Farm that morning, as she often did. The paddock was quiet. The horse was there. The sky was doing what early June skies do in Derbyshire, pale, soft, full of light. She had no reason, based on anything she had been told by police or anyone else, to believe she was in immediate danger. The case had been closed. The bag had been catalogued and forgotten. She was a young woman caring for her horse on a Thursday morning. At 8:13 in the morning, a call came in. Gracie had been found in the paddock. She was unconscious. She had been stabbed 10 times. One of those wounds severed an artery in her spine. There was no evidence of a physical assault. There was only the evidence of what Michael Sellers had brought with him to that field, and what he had done when he found her there, alone, in the place she had loved and trusted. Gracie Spinks died that morning. She was 23 years old. A few hours later, Sellers' body was found approximately 150 meters from where Gracie had fallen, just half a mile from the paddock in a nearby field. The coroner, Matthew Cooley, determined that he had died by suicide, having apparently inhaled helium. He had left a note, and the note, in its chilling self-justification, said that he could not deal with all of her lies. Even in death, Michael Sellers refused to accept responsibility. Even in the final act of his life, it was her fault. In November 2023, more than 2 years after Gracie's death, an inquest jury sat at Chesterfield Coroner's Court and listened, week after week, to the full account of what had happened and, more painfully, what had not happened. The 10 jurors wore pink and purple wristbands in Gracie's memory throughout the proceedings. When the foreman delivered their conclusions, he did not refer to Sellers by name. In a gesture that captured both the horror of his actions and the contempt his behavior deserved, the foreman called him simply the supervisor. He said, "It was the supervisor that killed Gracie." Their verdict was unlawful killing. Their findings were a systematic indictment of the failures that had left Gracie unprotected. They found that the stalking report had been inadequately investigated. They found that the verbal warning to Sellers had been insufficient and potentially counterproductive. They found that no one had properly considered a stalking prevention order, which could have legally restricted Sellers' movements and contact with Gracie. And they found that the most damning single failure of all, the bag of weapons left outside her stables with a note demanding she not lie, had been catastrophically mishandled. 5 police officers in total received disciplinary notices. 2 were sanctioned for the handling of Gracie's stalking report. 3, including a sergeant, were sanctioned for their handling of the weapon-filled bag. Detective Superintendent Darren Dadh stood before the cameras outside the court and said the words that no officer wants to say. "As a force, we failed Gracie." He offered the force's most sincere apologies. It was the right thing to say, and it came too late. The inquest jury noted, carefully and honestly, that they could not conclude with certainty that the police failings had directly caused Gracie's death. Michael Sellers had been determined, premeditated, and deliberate. He might, in another timeline, have found a way regardless. But the jury's inability to make that final causal link did not diminish what had happened. Gracie had asked for help. She had done everything right. She had gone to her employer. She had gone to the police. She had named the man who frightened her. She had described exactly where he had turned up. And the system she had trusted had looked at the danger in front of it and called it low risk. In the months and years following Gracie's death, something shifted. Not quickly enough, and not without the sustained pressure of her family's grief and advocacy, but visibly. The Independent Office for Police Conduct investigated Derbyshire Constabulary's conduct. A Prevention of Future Deaths report was issued by the coroner in January 2024, specifically aimed at preventing the same failures from occurring again, addressing how stalking cases are assessed, how found property near victims' locations is treated, and how police forces communicate across reports. In December 2024, Gracie's parents, Allison and Richard, spoke publicly about new government measures designed to better protect stalking victims. They said they were delighted. The pride and exhaustion in that word, delighted, from two parents who had buried their 23-year-old daughter and then spent 3 years fighting to make her death mean something beyond itself, was its own kind of tribute to who Gracie must have been and to the family that raised her. And in November 2024, a footpath near Duckmanton was quietly, formally renamed in Gracie's honor, a small, permanent mark on the landscape of Derbyshire, a way of saying that a young woman had walked here and loved this place and deserved to be remembered in it. She does not walk it now, but her name remains. The story of Gracie Spinks is, at its core, a story about a young woman who did everything society tells women to do when they feel unsafe. She told her employer. She told the police. She named the person who frightened her. She documented her fear. She tried to protect herself by trusting the institutions that exist for exactly that purpose. And she was failed step by step by each of those institutions in turn, until the morning the danger she had been warning everyone about walked through the gate of her horse's paddock and found her alone. Stalking is not a lesser crime. It is not the awkward persistence of a lonely or misguided person. It is a pattern of control, of threat, of slow psychological siege, and, in far too many cases, of which Gracie's is not even the only one, it ends in lethal violence. The warning signs in Gracie's case were not subtle. They were explicit: a workplace history involving 7 other women, a refusal to accept the end of contact, a surveillance operation conducted using work equipment, an appearance at the specific private location the victim had disclosed to police, and then a bag of weapons left at that same location with a note invoking her credibility. The path from February 2021 to June 18, 2021 was not hidden. It was visible to anyone who looked. There is a cruelty in the note sellers left behind, the note about her lies, that speaks to something deeply disturbing about the psychology of obsessive control. It frames the entire tragedy from his perspective. Her rejection was a lie, her fear was a lie, her asking for help was a lie. Every act of self-protection she took was, in his reframing, a form of aggression against him. This is the language of a man who could not conceive of a world in which her wishes mattered more than his. That he took his own life after killing her was described by the coroner as an act designed to remove himself from accountability. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no verdict pronounced against him in a court of law. He had, in a final act of control, denied Gracie's family even that. What they have instead is a footpath with her name on it, a foreman in a courtroom calling her killer the supervisor, and the knowledge that Gracie had done nothing wrong. She had loved horses and swimming and the Derbyshire countryside. She had made friends easily and let them go gracefully when the time came. She had trusted the people whose job it was to protect her. She had gone to see her horse on a Thursday morning in June. She was 23 years old, and she deserved so much more than the world gave her. Story 5. There is a neighborhood that carries the quiet confidence of a place that has never been asked to account for itself. Chevy Chase, Maryland, sits just north of Washington, D.C., in a part of the world where wide, tree-lined streets give way to grand old homes set behind trimmed hedges and manicured lawns. It is the sort of community where children grow up riding bikes to friends' houses and neighbors know each other by first name, where spring mornings smell of blooming dogwood and the air has a softness that seems almost deliberately peaceful. It does not look like the kind of place where terrible things happen. Of course, that is the illusion. Terrible things happen everywhere. On the morning of May 2nd, 2001. Someone made a phone call that ended that illusion on Drummond Avenue forever. Leslie Jennings Prior was 49 years old, and by the accounts of everyone who loved her, she was the kind of person who made a room feel inhabited the moment she stepped into it. She had a warmth that people described not simply as friendliness, but as something deeper, a genuine, attentive interest in the people around her. She was a mother, a wife, and a working woman. She held a position at an advertising production firm in the area, the kind of professional life that gave structure to her days and purpose to her mornings. She was well regarded there, reliable, the sort of colleague whose absence would be noticed immediately. She lived with her husband, Carl Sandy Prier, in the family home on Drummond Avenue in Chevy Chase, a quiet residential street where the houses sat close enough to neighborliness without sacrificing privacy. They had a daughter, Lauren, who had been a teenager in the years leading up to that spring. Lauren was, by every account, extraordinarily close to her mother. Theirs was the kind of bond that anchors a young woman as she steps into adulthood. A closeness built not just from love, but from genuine friendship, from shared laughter, from the quiet language that forms between mothers and daughters over years. Leslie had her struggles, too, as most people do. Sandy, speaking to investigators in the days after her death, acknowledged that their marriage had grown strained and hinted at difficulties that had built quietly over time. But those are human things, the texture of real lives. The Leslie that the people who loved her remembered was someone whose kindness had left marks on others, marks that would only become fully visible in the years of grief that followed. May 2nd, 2001, began like any other spring day in Chevy Chase. Sandy Prier left the house on Drummond Avenue at approximately 7:30 in the morning, heading to work. The sun was up. The streets were quiet. He drove away, and the house settled into the particular stillness of a weekday morning. Leslie never arrived at her office. When she failed to appear and could not be reached, a colleague at the advertising firm grew concerned. In the world of professional routine, an unannounced absence from someone as dependable as Leslie was not something to be dismissed. The colleague made calls. Sandy was contacted. Together, husband and coworker arrived at the house on Drummond Avenue and stepped inside. What they found stopped them cold. The home that Sandy had left only hours before, orderly, familiar, the backdrop of their shared life, had been transformed into a scene of unmistakable violence. Dried blood marked the floors. A table had been overturned, its legs pointing helplessly toward the ceiling. A rug lay displaced, shoved aside in some desperate movement. Blood was splattered across the floor of the foyer, across the back door, and across various appliances throughout the house. A silent, terrible record of what had happened in the hours between Sandy's departure and this moment. They called 911 immediately. Officer Jim Barnett of the Montgomery County Police Department was among the first to arrive. What investigators found as they moved through the house confirmed the worst. Leslie Prier was discovered in the upstairs bathroom, deceased. The autopsy that followed would determine her cause of death as blunt force trauma. Her head had been battered against the foyer floor. She had been strangled. She had fought. The bruises and injuries on her body told the story of a woman who had not gone quietly, who had clawed and struggled and resisted with everything she had. Most significantly, and most crucially for the investigation that would follow, examiners found male DNA lodged beneath Leslie's fingernails. In her final moments, she had reached out and seized something from her attacker, biological material that he could not take back, that he could not dispose of, that would remain in an evidence bag for the next 23 years, waiting. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. When there is no broken window, no jimmied lock, no trail of mud leading in from outside, an investigation turns inward. The absence of forced entry whispered a terrible possibility. Whoever had done this to Leslie Prier had been let into the house, or had a key. Suspicion moved like weather toward Sandy Prier. In the days following the murder, Sandy spoke to investigators on tape. He admitted that his marriage had been strained. He talked about Leslie's drinking, speaking with the worn candor of a man trying to be honest, but choosing words that landed badly under scrutiny. He spoke about sometimes coming home late to avoid the tension. Whatever his meaning, his words painted a picture of a man who had been unhappy at home, a man whose marriage had frayed at its edges. And in a murder case, unhappy husbands carry a weight of suspicion that is very difficult to shift. His movements on the evening before Leslie's body was discovered further unnerved investigators. Neighbors told police they had noticed something strange that night. Every light in the Prier house had been on, but all the curtains and drapes were tightly drawn. One neighbor described finding this deeply unusual. The house had been brilliantly lit from the inside, but deliberately sealed off from the outside world. Sandy, when asked where he had been that evening, described a sequence of ordinary errands. A visit to the dump, stops at 3 separate stores to find a battery charger for his car. To investigators, this account had the quality of something that had been constructed rather than remembered, the kind of itinerary designed to account for time. Detective Allison DuPois, who would later work the cold case, reviewed these records and was struck by what she described as a suspicious quality in the movements. It seemed like he was trying to create an alibi for himself, she reflected. Then came the polygraph. Sandy agreed to take a lie detector test. He failed it. The cumulative weight of these facts bore down on him relentlessly. A strained marriage, suspicious behavior the night before, a failed polygraph. For many in the community, and within the investigation itself, the conclusion seemed to reach its own hand forward. Sandy Prier became, in the court of informal judgment, a man who had killed his wife and somehow escaped justice. But 2 months after Leslie's murder, the results of a forensic test came back from the laboratory, and they contained a single, stubbornly inconvenient truth. The male DNA found under Leslie's fingernails, the DNA that she had fought hard enough and held on tightly enough to preserve in death, did not belong to Sandy Prier. It did not match anyone in the available databases. The case had its biological evidence. It had no suspect. And for the next 2 decades, that is exactly where it stayed. Cold cases do not disappear. They sit in filing cabinets and storage rooms, waiting in the patient way that evidence waits, inert, accumulating dust, but not gone. The DNA sample under Leslie's fingernails was preserved. The case file remained open. But without a match, without a name to attach to those cells, investigators could not move forward. For Lauren Prier, the silence was its own kind of torment. She had lost her mother to an act of sudden violence, and in the years that followed, she had watched her father carry the invisible brand of suspicion. Friends, neighbors, and perhaps strangers who knew of the case spoke with that knowing certainty that communities sometimes develop around unresolved tragedies. Sandy Prier spent the remainder of his life under that cloud. He died in 2017, never having been charged, but also never having been publicly cleared in a way that felt definitive and final. Lauren carried both griefs simultaneously, the grief for her mother, and the grief of watching her father diminished by a suspicion that was never properly resolved. She carried a question that had no answer. Who had come into their home on Drummond Avenue, and why? And she carried, beneath everything, the knowledge that whoever it was remained somewhere in the world, free, living a life that Leslie Prier had never been allowed to finish. In 2022, Montgomery County Police Department made a decision that would change everything. Detective Tara Augustine had spent her career working toward the cold case unit. She had wanted this assignment for as long as she had been in law enforcement. Throughout my whole career, my goal was to get to the cold case unit, she later told News. These are all major crimes. They're homicides or rapes, and there are ones that haven't been able to be solved. And I like the challenge of trying to look at everything with fresh eyes. Alongside her partner, Detective Allison DuPois, another experienced investigator who brought her own sharp instincts to the case, Augustine was assigned to Leslie Prier's murder. The 2 women immersed themselves in the original case file, examining it not as investigators trying to confirm what previous detectives had believed, but as fresh minds willing to let the evidence lead. One of their first decisions was to reach out to Lauren. This was not merely professional courtesy. It was a recognition of something human. Lauren had spent 21 years waiting. That weight was not lost on the two detectives who had taken responsibility for her mother's case. The tool that would transform this investigation was relatively new and extraordinarily powerful: forensic genetic genealogy. The principle behind it was elegant in its logic. Rather than simply comparing DNA to a database of known criminal profiles, as traditional Cody's testing did, this technique took an unknown DNA sample and compared it against publicly accessible genealogy databases, the kind where ordinary people upload their genetic information to discover distant cousins and map their family trees. The technique would then identify relatives of the unknown donor, sometimes distantly related, and from there, investigators would build out family trees by hand until the probable identity of the unknown donor emerged. In September 2022, Montgomery County Police partnered with Othram, a Texas-based genetic genealogy company that had developed some of the most sophisticated analytical tools in the field. They submitted the DNA sample from under Leslie Preer's fingernails for advanced testing. What came back was not a simple name. It was the beginning of a long and painstaking journey through thousands of potential family connections. For a year and a half, Augustine and DuPuy worked through the results, building intricate family trees, eliminating branches, following the genetic threads wherever they led. Most of the initial matches connected to existing American family lines and went nowhere definitive. Then something changed. The highest confidence DNA match that the analysis produced was linked not to an American family, but to a family in Romania. Augustine began searching publicly available records related to that Romanian family line. She pulled up articles, documents, any accessible information she could find. And then, searching through the original case file with the Romanian surname fresh in her mind, she found something that made her stop. The name Gliger was already in the case file. It had been recorded years earlier, in the original investigation, as a peripheral name. Someone connected to the family, someone who had visited the house, someone who had been part of the background of Lauren Preer's teenage life. Eugene Theodore Gliger had been Lauren's high school boyfriend. He had visited the house on Drummond Avenue. He had been, for a period of those teenage years, someone who sat at the Preer family table, who passed through their hallway, who knew the layout of that home and the faces of the people who lived in it. He had been interviewed by police during the original investigation, as had many people connected to the family. Nothing had come of it. Without DNA technology capable of making the connection, he had remained exactly what he appeared to be: a former high school boyfriend, long since departed from Lauren's life. The couple had broken up years before the murder. But now, using the family trees they had painstakingly constructed, Augustine and DuPuy determined that Eugene Gliger was a first cousin twice removed from the Romanian genetic match in the genealogy database. The mathematics of DNA relatedness pointed, quietly but insistently, in his direction. The challenge now was confirmation. Gliger's DNA had never been entered into Cody's or any law enforcement database. There was no criminal record that would have placed his profile there. The detectives could not simply check a system. They needed to collect a sample from him directly, in a way he would never know about. They found their opportunity in the air. Working with customs officials at Dulles International Airport, investigators arranged to observe Gliger as he passed through. He drank from a water bottle. He discarded it. That discarded bottle, that ordinary throwaway act, contained everything investigators needed. The water bottle was retrieved. DNA was extracted from it. The analysis was fast and unambiguous. The DNA from the discarded water bottle matched the DNA found under Leslie Preer's fingernails. It was the same person. It had always been the same person. On June 18, 2024, the United States Federal Marshals Task Force arrived at Eugene Gliger's apartment in Washington, D.C. He was 44 years old now, more than 2 decades removed from a Tuesday night in the spring of 2001, when he had been a young man of 20. When the officers arrived, Gliger appeared confused. "What's happening?" he said. "What's this about?" He was arrested and extradited to Maryland to face charges of murder. During his initial interviews with detectives Augustine and DuPuy, he denied any involvement. They were patient. They had waited 23 years. A few more conversations were nothing. It was only when the full weight of the evidence was laid before him. The DNA found in multiple locations throughout the home, the devastating match to the material under Leslie Preer's fingernails, the family tree that had traced its way across the Atlantic from a genealogy match in Romania to his front door, that the architecture of his denial began to give way. In May 2025, standing in a Maryland courtroom, Eugene Theodore Gliger pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. August 28, 2025, the Montgomery County Circuit Courthouse in Rockville, Maryland, filled in the way that certain proceedings fill rooms, not with the chatter of the curious, but with the dense, particular silence of people who have suffered a long time and arrived at a moment they were not sure would ever come. More than 60 people filled the courtroom. Lauren Preer was there. Her family was there. The friends of a woman who had been killed 24 years earlier, people who had carried her loss through decades of ordinary life, were there. Detectives Augustine and DuPuy sat in the courtroom too. They had built the case that brought this day into existence, and they had earned the right to see it through to its conclusion. Eugene Gliger spoke. He stood before the court and acknowledged a truth he had concealed for most of his adult life. He said, "Leslie always was very kind to me." He spoke of blackouts, of a night of drinking alcohol and using drugs, of a blur where memory should be. "I vaguely remember leaving the Preer house in the morning, but the rest is a blur. I know Lauren and Leslie's family want to know why I was there and what happened. I'm sorry. I'm unable to remember and provide an explanation." Prosecutors, in their sentencing memorandum, offered a pointed response to this claim of blurred memory. They noted that Gliger was unwilling to admit his motive and the full extent of his horrific conduct, that his professed inability to explain himself was not confusion but concealment. A woman had clawed at him hard enough to preserve his DNA under her fingernails. There had been a struggle. There had been specific, targeted acts of violence. Whatever had happened in that house on Drummond Avenue in the early hours of May 2nd, 2001, it had not been an accident, and it had not been nothing. Judge David Lease sentenced Eugene Gliger to 30 years in prison, with all but 22 suspended. He would also serve 5 years of supervised probation upon release. Bittersweet. That word carries more than any headline can. Carl Sandy Preer, the husband who had failed a polygraph and spent years under the shadow of informal suspicion, never lived to see this day. He died in 2017, 8 years before the man who actually killed his wife was sentenced in open court. He spent the last 16 years of his life in a community that, however quietly or however charitably, had wondered about him. The exoneration that came with Gliger's arrest arrived too late for Sandy to receive it. Lauren Preer, who had defended her father fiercely throughout those years while simultaneously carrying her own grief for her mother, described the revelation of her one-time boyfriend's guilt with a single word: unreal. It is a word that does extraordinary work. It captures the vertigo of discovering that the person who destroyed your family was someone you had once trusted, someone whose name you had spoken with affection, someone who had sat at your kitchen table. It captures the collapse of a reality you had built to make sense of the world. The truth of what happened on Drummond Avenue on the night of May 1st into May 2nd, 2001, is still not entirely known. Gliger offered no coherent motive. Why he was there that night, what brought a 20-year-old man to the home of his former girlfriend's family in the early morning hours, remains a question without a complete answer. What is known is this: he was there, he knew the house, and he killed the woman inside it with such force that she hit the floor of the foyer with her head and had to be found in the bathroom above. What is known is that she fought him, that she did not simply accept what was being done to her, that she reached out and held on with her fingernails to the one piece of evidence that would, 23 years later, find its way to a courtroom and a sentence and 60 people saying, yes, out loud. Leslie Preer was 49 years old. She had been kind to the young man who had dated her daughter. She had gone to work faithfully enough that her absence, on a single Wednesday morning, was noticed within hours. She had a daughter who loved her so fiercely that she spent 2 decades fighting for her. She had a husband whose name she never saw cleared in his lifetime. And she had, beneath her fingernails in her final moments, the molecular signature of the person who had done this to her. A signature that waited, patient and inert, in the careful custody of investigators who refused to close the file. The house on Drummond Avenue still stands, as houses do. But the woman who made it a home has been gone for 24 years, and the silence she left behind, in her daughter, in her family, in the community that gathered in a courtroom to say yes, is a silence shaped precisely in her form. Story 6. There is a peace that settles over small lakeside towns in the American Midwest when autumn turns the leaves and the summer crowds thin out along the shores. Vermilion, Ohio sits on the southern edge of Lake Erie, a town of modest streets, good churches, and the kind of neighborly trust that makes people leave their windows unlocked at night. It is the sort of place where men work hard with their hands and take pride in what they build, where couples grow old together, and where the idea of violence, real, calculated, deliberate violence, feels like something that happens far away, in cities on television screens, not here. On the gray November morning of November 18th, 2009, that sense of distance collapsed. Inside a house on North Ridge Road, a 36-year-old man named Jeremy Simcoe lay in his own bed, shot once in the back of the head. His wife, Julene, was hysterical and covered in blood. And within hours, the investigators who arrived at that house would begin to feel the slow, unsettling certainty that something in the story they were being told did not fit the shape of the truth. Jeremy Simcoe was the kind of man who filled a room simply by walking into it. He was broad-shouldered and commanding, someone his friends described without hesitation as a man's man. He ran his own tree service business, the sort of outdoor physical work that suited his temperament, that let him be outdoors, moving, building. He was a firearms enthusiast in the way that men in that part of Ohio often are, not as a hobby but as something close to a calling. He knew guns, respected guns, and kept them with the care of someone who understood both their power and their responsibility. His friends remembered his personality with the particular fondness that acknowledges complexity without diminishing affection. He had a temper, they admitted. He was dominant, aggressive in the way that certain men are, not maliciously but as a matter of nature. If you crossed him, there'd be a fight, one friend named Al Hop recalled. But they also remembered him as loyal, deeply present in his relationships, someone whose company filled the space it occupied. He and Julene had met not long after she finished high school. She had been considered pleasant, studious even, a young woman who made the honor society and moved through the world with a surface of ordinary Midwestern warmth. Beneath that surface, however, she carried something that almost no one around her fully understood. A childhood marked by serious sexual abuse at the hands of her own father, who had been imprisoned for the offense. The impact of such wounds does not announce itself. It moves beneath the skin, shaping choices and vulnerabilities in ways that take years to fully surface. When Julene met Jeremy, the attraction was immediate and consuming. Friends marveled at how completely the two fell for each other. She talked about how much she loved Jeremy. I mean, there wasn't a story that didn't have Jeremy, remembered a friend named Jean Marie Becker. They worked together and played together. They were a normal, happy couple. Always together, it worked for them. They built a life on North Ridge Road. By the standards of Vermilion, it was a good life. They had land. They had animals. Jeremy ran his business with the focus of someone who knew what he wanted and worked relentlessly toward it. The house they shared reflected his personality in almost every detail. What struck investigators when they first began to examine the Simcoe property, even before the full weight of the evidence settled in, was the extraordinary degree to which the house had been secured. Jeremy Simcoe was a man who believed in protection. The home bristled with security measures, multiple alarm systems, motion detectors at the perimeter, cameras positioned to monitor the exterior, alarms on the doors and windows, alarms on the outside of the garage, and dogs that patrolled the property. There was a large gun safe stored beneath the stairs. The couple kept firearms positioned at strategic points throughout the house. This was not paranoia. It was the thoughtful, systematic security architecture of a man who took the protection of his home and his wife seriously, who had thought carefully about the ways in which the world outside might try to breach the world inside. He had, in every meaningful way, tried to make his home impenetrable. That fact would become the investigation's central, haunting question. If this house was built to keep intruders out, how did one get in? At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning on November 18, 2009, Julian Simcoe picked up the phone and called 911. The recording that survives from that call captures a woman in extreme distress, crying, barely coherent, her voice pitched upward by what sounded like raw terror. She told the dispatcher that her husband had been shot, that someone had broken into their home, that the attacker might still be inside. She needed help immediately. Vermilion Police Chief Robert Kish was among the first senior officers to arrive at the house on North Ridge Road. What he found was a scene of apparent chaos. Julian Simcoe was covered in blood, shaking, barely able to speak. Jeremy was found in the couple's bedroom, lying on the bed. A single gunshot wound to the back of his head. Already dead, Kish made the immediate decision to have Julian taken to the hospital. She was clearly in no condition to be questioned meaningfully, he reasoned. The scene itself would have to speak first. As the responding officers began their systematic examination of the house, a pattern started to emerge that did not align with Julian's account of a violent intruder. They found first that all the exterior doors were locked from the inside. No windows had been forced or broken. No alarm had been triggered. None of the motion detectors had recorded movement from outside. The dogs had not raised an alarm in the night. Jeremy was sleeping, or had been sleeping, when the fatal shot was fired. The angle of entry, a single bullet into the back of the head, suggested someone who had approached him from behind while he lay still. Kish would later say that what the physical evidence made clear was deeply disturbing. Whoever shot him had to be within inches of him, and basically almost either crawl in bed or lay in the bed. In the bedroom, police found a 9mm Smith & Wesson handgun and 2 spent shell casings. Upstairs, they found bullet holes in the hallway wall. Julian would later explain these away by saying that after finding Jeremy wounded, she had fired the 9mm into the hallway to frighten away whoever she believed was still hiding in the house. In the kitchen, officers found a .357 Magnum Smith & Wesson revolver. They examined it carefully. It held 5 live cartridges and 1 spent cartridge in the chamber. Jeremy Simcoe had sustained 1 gunshot wound. Police Chief Kish stood looking at that weapon and said what everyone in the room was thinking. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that very well might be the weapon that was used to shoot him. But at that moment, without forensic confirmation, it remained a theory. What the investigators needed was time, laboratory results, and patience. The morning after, and the gathering of doubts. The following morning, Julian called police again. She reported that she had been robbed, that someone had come back to the house while she was recovering and tampered with the gun safe beneath the stairs. Approximately $2,000 in cash was allegedly missing. More significantly, she said, the surveillance system, the cameras Jeremy had installed throughout the property, had been taken. Police arrived and examined the safe. It had indeed been tampered with. But again, there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an exterior breach. The surveillance system was gone, taking with it whatever footage it might have contained of the night of November 18th. For the investigators assigned to the case, this development carried the unsettling quality of a loose end being tied off, not by a frightened widow, but by someone methodically removing evidence. Then, on November 25th, 1 week after Jeremy's death, something happened that would stay in the memory of Vermilion Police Officer Corey Spores for years to come. Julian hosted an informal gathering at the house and invited Spores, who had been one of the first responders the night of the murder. During that gathering, Julian drew him aside. She looked at him and said something that he would never entirely forget. "I'd like to tell you what really happened, but I can't." Then her attorney intervened, and the conversation was over. Investigators noted this with the quiet intensity of people who have trained themselves to observe what other people miss. If Julian Simcoe was a grieving widow whose husband had been killed by a stranger, why did she need an attorney? Why would she have something to tell the police that she couldn't say? Why would she reach toward confession and then pull back? The forensic results that came back in the weeks that followed deepened every suspicion. The DNA analysis of the crime scene found no biological material belonging to any unknown individual. No strange fingerprints. No footprints from outside. No trace of any person who did not already live in the house on North Ridge Road. The perimeter cameras had captured nothing. The alarm systems had registered nothing. The dogs had heard nothing. There was no intruder. The evidence said so plainly. But naming the alternative out loud, naming the woman who had called 911 in tears, who had been taken to the hospital covered in her husband's blood, required more than the absence of a stranger. It required proof. As months became years and the investigation moved slowly forward, detectives were compelled to look deeper into the private world of the Simcoe marriage. What they found there was far more complex and far more troubling than anything visible from the outside. In going through the couple's personal photographs, videos, and computer records, investigators uncovered a picture of a domestic life that bore little resemblance to the normal, happy couple that friends had described. In the photo albums and recordings found in the house, there were extensive depictions of Julian in circumstances of bondage and submission. Some of the material appeared, to the investigators who reviewed it, to carry an ambiguity about consent that deeply disturbed them. Mrs. Simcoe appears to be crying in some photos. She appears to be in pain. It's hard to decide if she was genuinely enjoying the situation, Detective Sergeant Stephen Davis told investigators. Most significant of all was a document retrieved from the house. 14 handwritten pages that constituted what appeared to be a formal contract between the couple. It was a master-slave agreement, and it was extraordinarily specific. In it, Jeremy was designated as a paternal figure and Julian as the subordinate daughter figure. The document outlined in explicit detail how each party was to behave, what was expected, what the rules were, and what the consequences of breaking them would be. Investigators were careful to resist a simple reading of this document. They knew Julian's history, the years of childhood abuse at the hands of her own father, which had shaped her relationship to authority, intimacy, and power in ways that could not be quickly understood. Detective Davis reflected the measured complexity of this carefully. Knowing that she had been a victim when she was a child, we were concerned that maybe she was being forced to do things that she didn't want to do. The financial picture that emerged was equally telling. In the days immediately preceding Jeremy's murder, the bank had denied the couple a loan that they had applied for to purchase a piece of property behind their home. It was a refusal that, according to prosecutors, struck with a force well beyond its monetary value. It represented the collapse of a plan, the closing of a door, a concrete and recent frustration stacked upon the accumulated pressures of money problems that had been building quietly for some time. In November of 2013, for years after the murder, investigators sat down with Julian for a formal recorded interview. On the question of the intimate contract and the nature of her marriage, she was unequivocal. She had been a willing participant in everything, she said. Nothing had been forced. It was role-playing, she insisted, something she and Jeremy had chosen together. She denied that Jeremy had abused her. But in that same interview, something else surfaced that quietly recalibrated the investigation. Someone had accessed the online obituary of Julian's deceased father from the Simcoe family computer on the night of November 17th, the night before Jeremy was murdered. When asked about this, Julian said she had not been the one to look it up. Detective Davis, reviewing this fact alongside everything else, described what it suggested with the careful language of someone deeply troubled by what he was seeing. On the night before her husband was killed, someone in that house had looked up the death notice of the man who had abused her as a child. Whatever that meant, it was not nothing. In November 2013, 4 days after Julian's recorded interview, investigators received information that would become the linchpin of the eventual prosecution. A first responder nurse who had been present at the hospital on the night of Jeremy's murder came forward with something she had held in her memory for 4 years. On the night of November 18, 2009, as Julene was being treated at the hospital, still distressed, still covered in blood, the nurse had heard her say something. It was brief. It was perhaps spoken without full awareness, in the way that people sometimes speak in states of extreme distress. But the nurse heard it, and it startled her enough that she had asked Julene to repeat herself. What the nurse heard was, "I just shot my husband." When the nurse reacted with surprise and asked Julene to clarify, Julene had quickly corrected herself. "Oh, somebody shot my husband," she said. The nurse had been startled by the original words, but had not been sure, in that initial chaotic night, what to make of them. Now, for years later, she was telling investigators what she had heard. The distinction between "I just shot my husband" and "somebody shot my husband" is, of course, the difference between a confession and an alibi. It is the difference between truth and performance. Detective Davis reflected on the significance of that single slip with the gravity it deserved. The nurse had not been expecting it, had not been looking for it, had simply heard it from a woman who was perhaps, in that fractured moment of shock and blood and hospital lighting, not fully in control of the words she was using. On December 19, 2014, 5 years and 1 month after Jeremy Simcoe was found dead in his own bed, Julene Simcoe was indicted on multiple counts: aggravated murder, felonious assault, tampering with evidence, and firearms charges. She pleaded not guilty to all charges. The arrest, when it came, was the culmination of years of painstaking investigative work. The case that prosecutors had built was almost entirely circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses to the shooting, no video footage because the surveillance system had been removed the following morning, and no confession beyond the disputed statement to the nurse. What there was, instead, was an architecture of evidence that pointed, brick by careful brick, in a single direction. A locked house with no intruder, a dead man shot at point-blank range from a position requiring intimate proximity, a wife who had told a police officer she wanted to confess but couldn't, and the ghost of a slip of the tongue in a hospital room on the night it all began. The wait for trial was long. The case did not come before a court until October 2017. In the intervening years, Jeremy Simcoe's family and friends had lived with the knowledge of what they believed had happened, without the legal confirmation that justice requires. His father, Robert Simcoe, had waited nearly a decade, through the initial investigation, the years without charges, and the years between indictment and trial, for the moment when a court of law would say the words he already knew to be true. When Julene Simcoe's murder trial finally began in October 2017, she made a decision that would define the proceedings before a single piece of evidence was presented. She waived her right to a jury trial. She asked that Lorain County Common Pleas Judge Mark Butleski alone decide her guilt or innocence. In doing so, she placed her fate in the hands of a single man's judgment, a significant gamble, and one that suggested her legal team believed they had more to gain from a judge's sober reasoning than from the emotional responses of 12 ordinary citizens confronted with the details of this case. The prosecution walked the courtroom through a story told in layers. The locked doors, the absent intruder evidence, the forensic impossibility of the shot being fired by anyone not lying beside Jeremy in his own bed, the gun residue on the pillow, the removal of the surveillance system the morning after the murder, the financial pressures, the denied loan, the 14-page contract, and, most damning of all, the nurse who had heard Julene Simcoe say the words that she had tried, unsuccessfully, to take back. A gunshot residue expert testified about trace material found on the bedding. Under cross-examination, he acknowledged something that the prosecution underscored with considerable care. Julene Simcoe had taken a class in forensic science at a local community college. She had watched true crime television programs regularly. She would, in all reasonable probability, have known how gunshot residue testing works, which made the partial absence of residue evidence on her hands not necessarily exculpatory, but rather consistent with someone who had taken precautions. The defense called no witnesses. Julian Simcoe did not take the stand. Her attorney argued instead that the police investigation had been narrow and myopically focused, that detectives had settled on Julian as their suspect and shaped their interpretation of the evidence accordingly rather than following it wherever it led. He suggested, in closing arguments, that a stranger robber or a hired assassin might have been responsible. The judge later addressed this directly and at length, working methodically through both alternative theories and finding insufficient evidence to support either. The verdict came on October 20th, 2017, guilty of aggravated murder, guilty of murder, guilty of felonious assault, guilty of tampering with evidence, guilty of firearms charges. Judge Butleski sentenced Julian Simcoe to 28 years to life in prison. She would not be eligible for parole until 2045. Outside the courthouse after sentencing, Robert Simcoe, Jeremy's father, spoke the words of a man who had waited 8 years for a moment he had been afraid might never come. "I hope she's miserable in prison every day and every night," he said. "It's been a lot of time, but we finally got justice for Jeremy." He added something that carried the quiet grief of a father forced to confront the arithmetic of violence. If Julian had been unhappy in the marriage, she could have simply left. She could have walked away from the house on North Ridge Road, from the 14-page contract, from the financial pressures and the denied loan, and whatever else had accumulated inside those locked doors. She could have chosen a different kind of freedom. Instead, on a November morning in 2009, she had chosen a different kind of ending. Julian's conviction was appealed. In April 2021, the Ninth District Court of Appeals in Akron reviewed the case in its entirety and upheld every finding. The panel of 3 judges concluded that there had been more than sufficient evidence to convict beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the trial court had applied the correct legal standard throughout. Jeremy Simcoe was 36 years old. He had worked with his hands, built a business, loved firearms, and been, by all accounts, a man of fierce presence, flawed and forceful and fully alive in the way that certain people are. He had installed cameras to watch for threats, and alarms to announce intrusions, and a gun safe to protect his arsenal, and none of it had saved him from the only threat he had not thought to prepare for. He had died in his own bed, in his own home, in a house where every door was locked from the inside. The silence of that house, the alarm that never sounded, the camera footage that was taken, the dogs that raised no cry, is the silence of a crime that hid in plain sight, inside the one space where a man believes himself most completely safe. And the slip of words spoken in a hospital room on a November morning, "I just shot my husband," was the crack in the wall through which, eventually, the truth found its way out. Story 7. The winter of 2011 found Bethany and Decker navigating the complex currents of young adulthood with a determination that those who loved her had come to recognize as her defining characteristic. At 21 years old, she was juggling responsibilities that would have overwhelmed many people twice her age. She attended George Mason University full-time, pursuing her education with the same focus she brought to everything in her life. To support herself and her young son, she waited tables at a local restaurant, balancing shifts with study sessions and parenting duties. And through it all, she maintained the warmth and care for others that made her beloved by family and friends. Bethany had grown into a young woman whose life was defined by love and responsibility. She was a mother to Kai, a toddler whose bright eyes and infectious laugh brought joy to everyone who knew him. She was married to Emil Decker, a member of the Army National Guard whose service to his country kept him deployed overseas for long stretches of time. The distance and separation had strained their marriage in ways that neither of them had anticipated when they first fell in love. Emil was stationed in a board, thousands of miles away from the apartment in Ashburn, Virginia, where Bethany lived. The phone calls and video chats could never fully bridge that distance, could never replace the simple comfort of being together. But Bethany's grandmother, Evelyn Bales, saw beyond the stress and the juggling act to the young woman she had always known. When Bethany visited on January 28, 2011, Bales made her granddaughter's favorite foods: homemade pizza and ginger snap cookies that filled the house with the warm scent of cinnamon and ginger. They spent hours together that day talking about school, work, and life. It was the kind of ordinary, precious time that families often take for granted, not knowing that such moments might become memories to cling to in darker days ahead. Yet even as they talked and ate and enjoyed each other's company, Bales noticed something troubling. Her granddaughter seemed edgy, more stressed than usual. Throughout the day, Bethany's phone kept ringing with calls and texts, interruptions that seemed to increase her tension rather than ease it. She was not herself, Bales would later recall. There was a troubled quality to her that afternoon, a sense that something was weighing heavily on her mind. What Bales didn't fully understand at the time was that Bethany's life had become far more complicated than the already demanding balance of school, work, and motherhood. During Emil's deployment, Bethany had met someone at the restaurant where she worked. His name was Ronald Roldan, and what had started as a workplace friendship had evolved into something more. As her marriage to Emil strained under the weight of distance and time apart, Bethany had begun a relationship with Roldan. She had moved out of her family home and into an apartment in Ashburn that she shared with him. And now, in January 2011, she was 5 months pregnant with what was believed to be Roldan's child. To those who knew Bethany best, the relationship with Roldan had become a source of deep concern. Her mother, Kimberly Nelson, had seen warning signs that made her increasingly worried for her daughter's safety. Roldan exhibited controlling behaviors that are classic indicators of an abusive relationship. He needed to know where Bethany was at all times. Friends and family later revealed that he had installed tracking software on her cell phone, monitoring her movements and communications. When Bethany left Kai in Roldan's care, the toddler had come back with bruises above his eyes. Roldan's explanation, that the child had fallen from a chair, did not fully satisfy Nelson's concerns. Eventually, Kai moved in with his grandmother full-time, away from Roldan's influence. Friends described Bethany as being trapped in a relationship she desperately wanted to escape, but couldn't seem to break free from. She confided in loved ones about the abuse she was experiencing, both physical and emotional. Roldan not only controlled her movements, but also threatened her family, using fear as a tool to keep her bound to him. Bethany had explored options for getting away: restraining orders, domestic abuse hotlines, escape plans, but she felt overwhelmed by the complexity of her situation. A restraining order, she told those trying to help her, was just a piece of paper. It wouldn't truly protect her from someone determined to harm her. In late January, Emil returned for a brief leave. Despite their separation and the complications in Bethany's life, he still loved his wife and wanted to reconcile. More than that, he was worried about her. He could see the toll that the relationship with Roldan was taking, and he wanted to get her away from that situation. So Emil planned something special: a trip to Hawaii, just the two of them, away from the stress and pressure and fear that had come to dominate Bethany's daily existence. They flew to Hawaii together, spending a week in a place where they could remember what had drawn them together in the first place. For Bethany, it was a respite, a chance to breathe without the constant surveillance and control. But even paradise couldn't provide complete escape. Throughout their time in Hawaii, Roldan sent a steady stream of text messages demanding that Bethany return, his jealousy and possessiveness reaching across thousands of miles of ocean. Bethany and Emil returned to Virginia on January 28th, landing back in the reality of their complicated situation. They spent that night at Bales's home, along with Emil's parents. It was the day of homemade pizza and ginger snap cookies, of conversation and togetherness, and of Bethany's visible stress as her phone continued to demand her attention. The next morning, January 29th, 2011, Bethany prepared to return to the Ashburn apartment she shared with Roldan. Emil saw her before she left his parents' home. They spoke, and then she got into her Hyundai for the hour-long drive back to Ashburn. What happened next would be pieced together only through fragments of information, testimony, and eventually, a confession that came more than a decade too late. Roldan later told investigators that he saw Bethany at the apartment in the early morning hours after she returned from her grandparents' house. According to his initial account, she went to bed, woke up in the morning, and then left to return to her grandmother's house. She never came back, he claimed, and he had no idea where she had gone. But the truth, as investigators would eventually learn, was far darker. At some point that day, Bethany called her employer to confirm her work schedule for the coming week. That phone call, made at 2:08 p.m., was the last verified contact anyone outside of Roldan's circle had with her. In the days and weeks that followed, Bethany's absence went unnoticed by many of the people in her life. This was possible because of something deeply disturbing. Someone was posting messages on her Facebook account, making it appear that she was still alive and active on social media. Friends received messages purportedly from Bethany, reassuring them that she was fine. Her sister saw posts that seemed to come from her. For almost 3 weeks, these digital breadcrumbs created the illusion that Bethany was simply busy with school and work, choosing not to respond to phone calls, but still engaged with the world through social media. But to those who knew Bethany best, something felt wrong. It was unlike her to go so long without checking in on Kai, the toddler son who was everything to her. Nelson, who was caring for the boy full-time, grew increasingly concerned as days turned into weeks without any direct contact from her daughter. Bales tried calling repeatedly, her worry mounting with each unanswered call. By February 19th, Nelson's concern had reached a breaking point. She asked Bethany's grandparents, who lived near Ashburn, to drive by the apartment and check on her. What they found was deeply unsettling. Bethany's Hyundai was parked outside the apartment, but not in the way they were accustomed to seeing it. The car sat at an unusual angle, one tire completely flat. Most disturbing was the thick layer of dust that covered the vehicle, as if it hadn't been moved in weeks. The grandparents knocked on the apartment door, but no one answered. They immediately contacted the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office to report Bethany missing. It was now 3 weeks since anyone had actually seen or heard from her. 3 weeks during which a young woman's life had been reduced to false social media posts designed to mask her absence. Detective Mark Bush and his colleagues from the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office responded to the report and began their investigation. When they gained access to Bethany's apartment, they found a scene that raised more questions than it answered. The apartment appeared to have been mostly cleaned out, though Bethany had been in the process of moving when she disappeared. In a closet, they discovered her small purse and her car keys, items she would have needed if she had truly left of her own accord. In the trunk of her dusty Hyundai, investigators found the car completely packed with her personal belongings and clothing. Beneath all of those items lay a computer and 3 cell phones, left behind like relics of a life interrupted. Bush noted that while the circumstances were deeply unusual, there were no obvious signs of violence in the apartment. No bloodstains marked the walls or floors. No bullet holes pierced the drywall. No weapon lay discarded in a corner. Whatever had happened to Bethany Decker, the physical evidence at the scene was frustratingly minimal. Investigators fanned out across the area surrounding the apartment complex, searching for any trace of the missing woman. They interviewed neighbors, checked security camera footage, and tried to reconstruct Bethany's movements on January 29th. The investigation quickly focused on the 2 men in her life, her estranged husband Emil and her boyfriend Ronald Roldan. When detectives tracked down Roldan at his mother's house in Centerville, where he had moved after the apartment lease expired, he presented himself as cooperative and concerned. Bush would later describe Roldan as very engaging, painting the entire relationship with Bethany in rosy terms. According to Roldan, everything had been fine between them. He had seen her briefly on the morning of January 29th, and then she had left, presumably to return to her grandparents' house. He claimed he simply assumed she had decided to stay with her family when she didn't return to the apartment. Investigators also interviewed Emil, who had returned to Afghanistan for his deployment. He had been at his parents' home when Bethany left on the morning of January 29th. In fact, he had followed her in his own car when she began driving back to Ashburn, concerned for her safety. They had stopped at a gas station, where Emil had filled up her tire and tried one last time to convince her not to go back to the apartment and to Roldan. But Bethany had been determined to continue on her own. Emil had watched her drive away, and then he had returned to his parents' house. Days later, he had flown back to Afghanistan. When Bethany failed to show up at the airport to see him off, friends and family had assumed it was because of their marital troubles. As investigators dug deeper, they learned disturbing details about Roldan's past. He had a criminal record that included an arrest for identity theft. Even more concerning, less than a month after Bethany's disappearance, Roldan had been arrested and charged with aggravated assault for cutting another person's neck with a knife. He had pleaded guilty to that charge and served time in prison. It painted a picture of someone with a capacity for violence, someone whose calm demeanor during interviews might be masking something far more sinister. But despite the concerning profile that emerged, investigators lacked the hard evidence needed to make an arrest. Without a body, without witnesses, and without physical evidence clearly linking Roldan to a crime, the case began to stall. Months turned into years, and Bethany's disappearance joined the ranks of cold cases that haunt law enforcement agencies and devastate families. For Nelson and the rest of Bethany's family, the absence of answers was a special kind of torture. They held out hope that somehow, somewhere, Bethany might still be alive. But as years passed without any trace of her, that hope grew dimmer. They channeled their grief into advocacy, working with organizations like Help Save the Next Girl, which was founded by another Virginia family whose daughter had been murdered. Nelson spoke publicly about the case, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. On the third anniversary of Bethany's disappearance, Nelson issued a public challenge to Roldan. She called on him to take a polygraph test, pointing out that she and other family members had already done so. "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about," she told reporters. But Roldan, through his attorney, declined to take the test. He maintained that he had answered all questions during the original investigation and was innocent of any crime. Then, in November 2014, nearly 4 years after Bethany vanished, investigators in Loudoun County received a call that would crack the case wide open. It came from police in Pinehurst, North Carolina, where a woman named Vicki Willoughby had been hospitalized following a brutal assault. Willoughby had been dating Ronald Roldan. On the night of the attack, he had turned violent after she refused to have physical relation with him. Roldan had beaten her savagely, punching her repeatedly in the head. In desperation, Willoughby had grabbed a revolver she had hidden under her couch and shot Roldan twice in the chest. But even with 2 gunshot wounds, Roldan had managed to overpower her, wrestle the gun away, and shoot her in the arm and the head. Willoughby had fled the house, bloody and battered, to get help from a neighbor. She would later lose an eye as a result of the injuries Roldan inflicted. When investigators interviewed Willoughby from her hospital bed, she told them something that sent chills through everyone involved in the Bethany Decker case. During their relationship, Roldan had made threatening statements about his ability to make people disappear. Specifically, he had told Willoughby, "I've made one girlfriend disappear. I can do it again." Roldan was arrested and charged with assault with a deadly weapon in North Carolina. In May 2016, he accepted a plea bargain and was sentenced to 6 to 8 years in prison for assaulting and shooting Willoughby. But the real significance of his incarceration was that it gave investigators in Virginia time to re-examine the evidence in Bethany's case, time to build a stronger case, and time to prevent Roldan from being deported to Bolivia, his native country, which had been a concern for prosecutors. During the renewed investigation, detectives made a crucial breakthrough. They found evidence suggesting that Roldan had been the one posting messages on Bethany's Facebook account after her disappearance, creating the digital illusion that she was still alive while he knew the terrible truth. In 2020, shortly after Roldan was released from prison in North Carolina, authorities in Loudoun County arrested him and charged him with abduction in connection with Bethany's disappearance. The case was finally moving forward after nearly a decade of frustration and dead ends. Over the next 2 years, prosecutors built their case while Roldan sat in jail awaiting trial. Then, on November 17, 2022, more than 11 years after Bethany disappeared, Roldan entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. In exchange for the plea, prosecutors agreed to a specific sentence rather than pursuing a trial that might have resulted in a longer prison term, but also carried the risk of acquittal. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for February 21, 2023. In the days leading up to that hearing, Detective Bush and prosecutors conducted a recorded interview with Roldan at the County Detention Center. On January 9, 2023, Roldan finally provided his account of what had happened to Bethany Decker. According to Roldan's confession, he and Bethany had gotten into an argument at their Ashburn apartment on January 29, 2011. He claimed that during the argument, he pushed her. She tripped and fell, hitting her head on a windowsill. He checked for signs of life, but found none. Rather than calling 911 or attempting to save her, Roldan said he panicked. He retrieved a large plastic bag, the kind used for disposing of Christmas trees after the holidays, and placed Bethany's body inside it. He taped the bag shut. Then he carried his girlfriend's body, along with the unborn child she was carrying, out to the apartment complex's trash compactor and threw them away. In the courtroom on February 21, 2023, Judge James P. Fisher sentenced Ronald Roldan to 40 years in prison, with 12.5 years to be served and the remaining 27.5 years suspended. It meant that Roldan would spend over a decade behind bars for taking Bethany's life and the life of her unborn child. Commonwealth's attorney Bhuta Bibridge addressed the court and the public, explaining that while Roldan had provided some answers, many questions remained. "She died in his hands," Bibridge said, her voice heavy with the weight of more than a decade of investigation. "We heard his explanation as to how her death occurred, and I think it still leaves a lot of questions. But at least we have some definitive responses, definitive answers to the fact that she's not disappeared. She has not just gone and run away. She was killed." Outside the courthouse, Kimberly Nelson stood before reporters and cameras, her face etched with a grief that would never fully heal. She spoke of the night before her daughter was murdered, when Bethany had called her one last time. "She called me," she said. "Mom, I love you," Nelson recalled, her voice breaking. "That was the last thing she told me." Nelson also shared a message born from her family's terrible experience: not to take for granted tomorrow. The truth was that Bethany's body has never been found and likely never will be. The trash compactor at the apartment complex had been emptied multiple times in the 3 weeks before investigators even knew Bethany was missing. Her remains, along with those of her unborn child, are believed to be buried somewhere in a landfill, mixed with years of accumulated refuse. There will be no grave to visit, no place where her family can go to feel close to her. The case of Bethany Decker is a devastating reminder of how domestic violence can escalate to murder, and how controlling relationships can trap victims in situations from which there seems to be no escape. Bethany had recognized that her relationship with Roldan was abusive. She had explored options for getting away from him. She had confided in family members about the threats and the violence. But the trip to Hawaii with Emil, the attempt at reconciliation with her husband, had apparently been the trigger that pushed Roldan over the edge. His jealousy and need for control had culminated in violence that took 2 lives. For Kai, who was just a toddler when his mother disappeared, growing up without Bethany has meant learning about her through stories and photographs, through the memories of grandparents and other family members who can tell him about the mother who loved him so deeply. He will never experience her presence, never hear her voice, never feel her embrace. His entire life has been shaped by her absence. Ronald Roldan will eventually be released from prison, having served his sentence for a crime that destroyed not just Bethany, but everyone who loved her. He will have the chance to rebuild some semblance of a life, to breathe free air and make choices about his future. Bethany will never have that chance. Neither will the child she was carrying. Their futures were stolen on a January day in 2011, their bodies thrown away, their lives reduced to a confession that came more than a decade too late to save anyone.